Between April and October 2024, Iran conducted two direct military strikes against Israeli territory, the first such attacks in the 45-year history of the Islamic Republic. The second strike, on October 1st, put over 30 ballistic missiles inside Nevatim Air Base, home to Israel's F-35 fleet, the official Israeli response described the damage as limited. The satellite imagery told a different story, and the pattern emerging from these strikes reveals something that Western defense coverage has been reluctant to say out loud. Iran is not trying to win a single decisive engagement. It is systematically testing, mapping, and degrading the operational infrastructure that Israeli air power depends on. And it is doing so with increasing precision, increasing volume, and decreasing restraint. Here's what we're covering. First, what actually happened in the October 2024 strike on Nevatim, not the official narrative, but what the satellite imagery confirmed. Second, the pattern of escalation between April and October and what it reveals about Iranian targeting doctrine. Third, the specific vulnerabilities in Israeli airbase infrastructure that Iran has been systematically exploiting. Fourth, why the damage assessment that matters is an aircraft destroyed but operational capacity degraded. And fifth, where this trajectory goes next, because the evidence suggests Iran is building towards something, not simply reacting. The thesis: Iran is not crippling Israel's air force in a single strike. It is conducting a slow-motion capability degradation campaign, testing defenses, refining targeting, and systematically removing the margin of error that Israeli air operations depend on. Let me walk through the verified facts first, because precision matters when the official narrative and the observable evidence don't fully align. On October 1, 2024, Iran launched what it called Operation True Promise EI, a response to the assassination of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut. Over 180 ballistic missiles were fired at targets across Israel. The majority were intercepted or impacted in unpopulated areas, but 32 confirmed Iranian ballistic missiles hit Nevatim Air Base in the Negev Desert. Nevatim is not a random target. It is the single most strategically concentrated air power facility in Israel. 3 F-35I squadrons are based there: the 140th Golden Eagle, the 116th Lions of the South, and the 117th First Jet. The base also houses aerial refueling tankers, electronic warfare platforms, the wing of Zion State aircraft, and the entire maintenance and logistics infrastructure required to keep fifth-generation stealth fighters operational. Post-strike satellite imagery from Planet Labs, analyzed by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and cross-referenced by open-source intelligence researchers at Bellingcat, showed cratering on taxiways connecting runways to aircraft shelters, damage to at least one hangar roof near the F-35 maintenance area. Impact patterns consistent with deliberate aim point selection rather than random area saturation, and an assessed circular error probable in the 8-12 meter range, meaning the missiles hit within 8-12 meters of their intended targets. Here's what the imagery also showed that the official statements didn't emphasize. The hardened F-35 shelters themselves were not the primary impact zone. Fabian Hinz, a senior researcher at the International Institute for Strategic Studies specializing in missiles and missile defense, wrote in his post-strike assessment, "The precision demonstrated at Nevatim is consistent with single-digit meter accuracy. These are not weapons that miss, these are weapons that hit the specific aim points their operators selected." And the aim points selected were peripheral infrastructure, not the most valuable targets on the base. Why does that matter? Because it means Iran chose not to target the shelters. It demonstrated that it could, and then didn't. That distinction is the analytical foundation of everything that follows. To understand where this is going, you need to see where it's been. On April 13th and 14th, 2024, Iran launched Operation True Promise, its first ever direct strike on Israeli territory, in response to Israel's April 1st strike on Iran's consulate in Damascus, which killed Quds force commanders. Over 300 drones and missiles were launched. The strike was massive in scale but carefully calibrated in effect. Most projectiles were intercepted by a coalition defense effort involving Israel, the US, UK, France, and Jordan. The few that penetrated caused minimal damage, a hit on Nevatim Air Base that damaged a runway but didn't crater it severely, and minor impacts at Ramon Air Base in the south. The Israeli and American assessment at the time: Iran's attack was more symbolic than operationally effective. The technology worked, but the volume was manageable. 6 months later, on October 1st, Iran struck again. This time there were fewer drones, which are easier to intercept, and more ballistic missiles, which are harder. There was a tighter concentration of impacts on strategic targets, specifically Nevatim. There was demonstrated terminal guidance precision that wasn't visible in April, and 32 missiles penetrated to a single high-value target despite active Arrow 3, David's Sling, and Iron Dome engagement. Seth Frantzman, a defense correspondent who has covered Israeli air operations for over a decade, wrote after the October strike, "The April attack was Iran showing it could reach Israel. The October attack was Iran showing it could hit specific buildings inside specific Israeli air bases. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a qualitative shift. What changed between April and October? Iran's missile production continued. Its targeting intelligence improved, likely refined using satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and the data collected from the April strike itself. And critically, Iran demonstrated that it was willing to tolerate Israeli retaliation in order to continue testing its strike capabilities in real-world conditions. Every strike Iran conducts is simultaneously an attack and a data collection exercise. Every impact confirms targeting coordinates. Every defensive response maps Israeli intercept prioritization. Every secondary explosion reveals storage configuration vulnerabilities. The pattern is not random retaliation. It is iterative refinement. Let me explain what Iran has learned, and what that learning reveals about Israeli airbase vulnerability. Israeli air bases were designed in an era when the primary threat was manned aircraft and short-range rockets from Gaza and Lebanon. Hardened shelters protect aircraft. Runways are built with rapid repair capability. Dispersal reduces concentration risk. But ballistic missiles with precision guidance change the calculus completely. You can harden aircraft shelters, but you cannot harden the taxiways that connect shelters to runways. A single well-placed crater on a critical taxiway junction grounds every aircraft in the shelters it connects, not because they're destroyed, but because they can't reach the runway. October 2024 imagery showed taxiway impacts at Nevatim. That's not random. That's deliberate targeting of mobility infrastructure. Modern fighter jets require enormous amounts of fuel stored in above-ground or semi-buried tanks connected by pipelines. A strike that ruptures fuel infrastructure doesn't need to destroy aircraft, it prevents them from flying. And fuel fires create secondary damage that extends far beyond the initial impact point. F-35s are the most maintenance-intensive fighter jets ever built. They require specialized equipment, trained personnel, climate-controlled facilities, and secure data links for diagnostics. Damage to maintenance infrastructure doesn't ground aircraft immediately, but it prevents damaged aircraft from being returned to service and accelerates the operational degradation of the entire fleet over time. Israeli air operations also depend on integrated data links, radar feeds, electronic warfare coordination, and communication networks that allow pilots to operate with real-time situational awareness. These systems depend on physical nodes, antenna arrays, server facilities, fiber optic junction points that are chargeable and vulnerable. An F-35 without access to the integrated air picture is still a capable aircraft, but it loses the networked advantage that makes fifth-generation air power decisive. Iran's October targeting demonstrated knowledge of where these nodes are located. That knowledge didn't come from guessing. It came from years of intelligence collection, satellite reconnaissance, and signals analysis. The assessment from multiple independent defense analysts, Iran has compiled detailed targeting packages for Israeli air bases that go well beyond hit the runway, including aim points for fuel infrastructure, maintenance facilities, communications nodes, and taxiway choke points, the kind of targeting that produces operational degradation, rather than just photogenic explosions. Here's where I need to be precise about language, because the difference between crippled and degraded is the difference between analysis and propaganda. Israel's air force is not crippled. As of today, the IAF remains the most capable air force in the Middle East. Its F-35I fleet is operational, its F-15 and F-16. Squadrons continue to conduct strikes across multiple theaters. Pilot training, command structure, and operational doctrine remain intact, but Israel's air force is being systematically degraded in ways that don't show up in aircraft counts. If taxiways are cratered, you can't get as many aircraft airborne per hour, even if the aircraft themselves are undamaged. If fuel infrastructure is damaged, tanker availability drops, which reduces the effective combat radius of strike aircraft. If repair facilities are hit, aircraft that would normally return to service in 48 hours stay grounded for weeks. And if air bases are under active threat, you have to dedicate air defense assets and alert fighters to base protection rather than offensive operations. None of these produce dramatic headlines, but cumulatively, they reduce the operational tempo, flexibility, and sustained capacity of air power. Retired Israeli Air Force Brigadier General Asaf Agman said in a November 2024 interview with Israeli defense publication Maariv, "The question is not whether our aircraft can fly. The question is whether we can sustain high-intensity operations over weeks and months when our infrastructure is being systematically targeted. That's a different kind of challenge than we've faced before. Every hour the IAF spends defending its own bases, repairing damage, and adapting to infrastructure loss is an hour it's not spending on offensive operations against Hezbollah, Hamas, or Iran itself. Iran doesn't need to destroy the Israeli Air Force. It needs to impose enough operational friction that Israel's freedom of action decreases." And from the pattern of strikes we've seen, that's exactly the objective Iran is pursuing. So let's talk about the future, not as prediction, but as trajectory analysis based on observed behavior. What Iran has demonstrated between April and October 2024 is a willingness to strike directly despite Israeli retaliation risk, an ability to penetrate Israeli air defenses in meaningful numbers, precision guidance capability at operational scale rather than just in isolated tests, iterative refinement where each strike is more targeted and more informed than the last, and restraint calibration showing Iran can hit harder than it has but chooses measured escalation. If the current trajectory continues, and there's no indication it won't, the next Iranian strike will likely target multiple bases simultaneously to stress Israeli air defense across geographic dispersal, use higher volumes of precision-guided ballistic missiles and fewer easy-to-intercept drones, focus on infrastructure targets that produce operational degradation in fuel, maintenance, and communications, and demonstrate less restraint as Iran becomes more confident in its ability to manage Israeli retaliation. Michael Knights, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy who has tracked Iranian military development for 2 decades, said in a December 2024 briefing, "Iran is not building toward a single knockout blow, it's building toward a sustainable capability to impose costs on Israeli air operations over time." That's actually more dangerous strategically than a one-time massive attack, because it's harder to deter and harder to defend against. The variable that could change this trajectory is external intervention. If the U.S. commits to direct defense of Israeli air bases with additional Patriot batteries, Aegis destroyers, and potentially F-22 air superiority fighters to defend airspace, that changes Iran's calculus, but it also escalates American involvement in ways that create risks in the Strait of Hormuz, risks to U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, and risks of broader regional war. The variable that could accelerate this trajectory is Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear program. If Israel conducts a major strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, which has been openly discussed in Israeli political and military circles, Iran's response will almost certainly exceed anything we've seen so far in scale and targeting. Scope. The restraint Iran has shown in April and October was calibrated to specific Israeli provocations. A nuclear facility strike would be treated as an existential threat, and the response would reflect that assessment. Here's the pattern. Iran is not trying to destroy Israel's air force in a single dramatic strike. It is conducting a systematic, iterative capability degradation campaign, testing defenses, refining targeting, imposing costs, and reducing Israel's operational margin. The April 2024 strike proved Iran could reach Israel. The October 2024 strike proved Iran could hit specific infrastructure inside Israel's most important airbase. The next strike, whenever it comes, will demonstrate something new, because that's what every Iranian strike so far has done. This is not about crippling Israeli air power, it's about degrading it incrementally, imposing friction on operations, forcing resource allocation to defense rather than offense, and demonstrating to regional audiences that Israeli air superiority is no longer absolute. And the uncomfortable truth for Israeli planners is that this kind of campaign, persistent, iterative, infrastructure-focused, and willing to accept retaliation as the cost of learning, is harder to counter than a single decisive battle. You can't win a war of attrition against an adversary that has accepted attrition as the strategy. Here's the question worth sitting with. Iran has now demonstrated in 2 separate verified strikes that it can penetrate Israeli air defenses and hit strategic infrastructure inside Israel's most important air bases, not with 100% success, not without losses, but consistently, repeatedly, and with increasing precision. If Iran continues this pattern, striking every few months, refining targeting, escalating incrementally, at what point does the cumulative degradation become operationally decisive? Not in the sense of destroying the IAF, but in the sense of reducing its sustained operational capacity enough that Israel's freedom of action in the region fundamentally changes? Because from the trajectory we've seen, that's the question Israeli planners are quietly wrestling with, and the one that Western defense analysis has been reluctant to confront directly.